Welcome to the latest of my deep dives. Today I'm going to explore tiny but hugely influential Pluto's annual 5-month retrograde, which begins on the 4th of May and goes through for 5 months and 10 days to the 14th of October. Pluto's going to invert just over 2 degrees, but it will this year be exclusively in the sign of Aquarius. I'm going to beg the question, what is Pluto about? What makes the retrograde different to Pluto in its forwards motion? Also, what is Pluto in Aquarius, and how has that been influential in its 3 visits? We're now on the 3rd. It began in the sign of Aquarius towards the end of March 2023 for 11 weeks. It came back last year on its birthday, the 21st of January to the 2nd of September. Then again, back into Aquarius from Capricorn from the 19th of November. Pluto moves slowly through each zodiac sign, so it's going to be in Aquarius now full time through to 243 before making its way into Pisces, back into Aquarius for one last time, and back into Pisces for its next longer stretch from 244. I'm astrologer Patrick Arundell. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to share with you what I feel Pluto represents, what the retrograde represents, the power of its presence in the sign of Aquarius, but also I'm going to share with you the event charts. Now I say charts because I'll share with you first the solar event chart. So that means we look at the whole zodiacal situation from 0 degrees Aries, the vernal point, which pictures Pluto in house 11. But that solar event chart shows Pluto forging other alliances, not least a wonderful one with Venus and Neptune, but a more challenging one with Mars. But I'm also going to share with you the natal event chart, and that gives us much more detail of where Pluto's energy will show up. Now that's based on universal time, Greenwich, because of the prime meridian, and that gives us an ascendant just in the sign of Libra. I'm then going to go through each of the zodiac signs from Aries through to Pisces to give you a flavour of what you can expect for your sign in terms of your ascendant, sun or the moon through to the middle of October. People often ask, what shall I watch? Well, if you know your astrology well, it's definitely for the ascendant. But aficionados of astrology will probably watch for the sun and the moon too. But if you're emerging in your interest in astrology, you won't go far wrong with the sun. It's very much to do with our desires in life, our thrust in terms of our innate energy. If you would like to discover more about your natal chart, you can download one for free. I think it's absolutely the best out there. Please see below for the link. But it will help you to understand not just where the big 3 are, the ascendant, sun and the moon, and also the houses they're in, but the other positions of all the other planetary players and the relationships, the aspects they enjoy too. On my new website, you can also subscribe for your free daily moon horoscope, but it's a natal reading, so that's based on your unique birth data. Or you can get your daily zodiac forecast fired to your device each morning as well. Subscribe for that. Or check out my wonderful tarot. It really is very insightful. All of that free. Please see below for more. But of course, if you do want a one-to-one with me, then please check out my testimonials below. See what other people have found having those readings with me. So Pluto, what is Pluto? Well, Pluto is a disputed entity, and some astronomers don't see it as a planet. Does that, however, change its influence? The answer is clearly no. So even if it is seen by some as a dwarf planet, it is incredibly powerful. Pluto can be about change. So in its very most positive influence. If we go with it, it can help us to evolve in our lives. Some people are lucky enough to have Pluto in, say, a trine with their sun, and the type of person who's always going through very big transformations in their lives, but they make it work for them. And one of the tricks is being able to let go. But the interesting thing about Pluto in the sign of Aquarius is it's a fixed sign, so we need to bear that in mind. But Pluto is also very much to do with power. It's said to be the ruler of the underworld, and therefore sometimes when Pluto is used in a more malicious or perhaps even unconscious way, it can be where people want to leverage control. And it can also be very much to do with the dark side of life, such as jealousy, manipulation, and some kind of leverage. But Pluto, in that more constructive sense, does help us to understand that life is a series of cycles. It begins with a birth, and it, of course, completes with a death. If we're more philosophical about that, we can see the more karmic influence of Pluto. And some astrologers are very much into Pluto as being hugely influential in terms of our past life, in association with the nodal axis too. However, Pluto can give us in some ways an appetite for things that aren't necessarily good for us. So that can be the things we become obsessed by, a person, a love relationship, a particular lifestyle choice like gambling, or perhaps imbibing a little bit too much in our favourite substance. Maybe also to do with some dark thoughts we have in terms of where we want to direct our energies. So if there is some destructive behaviour working in our lives at the present time, we need to understand if it's conscious or if it's subconscious, because one of the great things with Pluto is once we wake up to letting go of what it's trying to transform for us, that release actually frees up new energy, which then sparks the more phoenix-like energy. So we can have new and very positive developments in our situations. But inevitably, sometimes Pluto can take away things from us that we're not ready to release. And if you've ever been through that, and I think most of us have, it can be extremely painful indeed. Now, Pluto can also be about power. And so if anyone is showing up in our lives who in some ways wants to have some kind of assertion over us, dominate us in some ways, that can be Pluto as well. But what about Pluto in Aquarius? As I mentioned, for 11 weeks from March the 27th, 2023, we saw a lot more talk about AI. But of course AI had been in existence for some while, as of course automation and robotics are long-standing, but the conversation about them really seemed to light up in those 11 weeks. And it is becoming very much more entrenched in our worlds, because Pluto in Aquarius, the sign of Aquarius, has a duality. The co-ruler, the modern ruler, Uranus, is about progression, innovation, whereas the traditional ruler, Saturn, is very much about continuity, appreciating what we have that's well established, particularly friendships. The sign of Aquarius can be very much about our connections, the people we celebrate. It can also be where we rise above the material world and understand how some things in life are more important than money. But what Pluto in Aquarius has shown us is that some individuals have had huge power over us collectively, because Pluto is very much about the collective, but the sign of Aquarius is very much about where we're connected, because it's the sign of us as a group. So Aquarius is very much about groups, can be about collaboration and cooperation. So what we've seen since Pluto first made that initial visit, we're now in visit 3, is those significant individuals or those significant media or technology groups or technologies that we've become quite dependent on, very Plutonian, have got in some ways a much greater impact on how we lead our lives than perhaps we were quite aware of, or we kind of knew it, but now when we have a conversation, suddenly we're getting adverts flashing up on our phones which reflect that conversation. And that kind of stuff is not everybody's cup of tea. But what we've seen much more recently is the collective of individuals, Aquarius, are actually coming together and finding a voice and pushing back against the power of some of these individuals or these corporations that have such immense control over us through technology. Because the sign of Aquarius is very much about tech, very much about futuristic approaches, but because it can be a detached, it's an air sign and therefore a little bit cool, Pluto, which works in a very deep, not very obvious way, has seen transformations going on that I think many of us are becoming much more conscious of now. But what we all have a choice to do is eliminate things that are not good for us to be too dependent on. And that could be constantly checking our phones, of which I have a terrible tendency to do. I'm addicted to news. And in some ways that means that, yes, I'm right across what might be going on, but in another way that takes away me from being more focused on my inner world, which Pluto can be extremely valuable in terms of developing. So that's just the type of thing that perhaps I can work on more. But we also need to be conscious that when Pluto goes retrograde, the lessons it's going to teach us over that 5 months will be that much more profound and that much deeper. And that's really another positive side of Pluto. If we're up for personal development and working on ourselves in a very self-honest way, we can let go things that are no longer serving our greater good. So when I go through the 12 zodiac signs, you'll see that some of it might be releasing ourselves from certain relationships and associations that we may feel are very important, but actually are they? So that's one of the things that we can work on through the retrograde in terms of our personal mastery of who we are and what our life choices are. So that's the big opportunity. But I'd like to tell you about something else, and it's the dwarves, the 12th harmonic. Each zodiac sign, nominally 30 degrees, divide it by 12, we get 2.5 degree units. It's an Indian Vedic astrology approach. So the second 12th harmonic of Aquarius is actually sub-ruled by Pisces. So when this process begins at 3 degrees and 49, Pluto is in the second dward of Aquarius. And that Pisces energy can be about spirituality, can be about healing, can also be about what needs to be washed away in some ways, perhaps even rinsed out from our lives, if we care to take that Pisces principle to our hearts. It won't be until the 1st of August that the inversion, the retrograde, brings Pluto back into the first 2.5 degrees of Aquarius, which is very Aquarian. And remember, Aquarius does have that unique duality. On one hand, Saturn is saying stick, on the other hand, Uranus is very much saying twist. So there's a tension, and that tension will amp up quite significantly, I feel, from the 1st of August. But also on July the 25th, and a few days before and a few days afterwards, the Sun will be opposite Pluto in its retrograde. And that's a significant event of the whole year, along with the two squares. So we had the square when the Sun just entered the sign of Taurus, and we're going to get it when the Sun enters the sign of Scorpio. But that event on July the 25th is going to be a time when we may become more conscious of someone with very Mars type energy, manifested in a very showcase way in Leo. And because Mars is in Leo when this event begins, it's part of that event chart that I'll shortly be sharing with you. So just be aware that around that time in July, we could become much more conscious of a power battle. Because Mars in some ways, of course, is a warrior planet, can be about domination, but in a more impatient, prideful way. Pluto in Aquarius could be a bit more about, yes, the logic of a situation because of the detachment, but something could flame up. Who will this affect most? Well, if you do have planetary influences at the start of Taurus, Leo and Scorpio between 0 and 4 degrees, you're going to feel this in a very potent way, because that's going to create the squares in terms of Taurus and Scorpio and the opposition in terms of Leo. So be prepared, because some shifts, major shifts, may show themselves, and if you resist, that can make them much more painful. However, if you are a late cardinal sign in terms of influences or angles, so that would be Aries, Cancer, Libra or Capricorn, you can also feel this, along of course with early Aquarius people. But a little bit like Taurus, Leo and Scorpio, in the case of Aries, Cancer and Libra, the very late positions in those signs will pick up the signals of this retrograde as well. So tension can play out there as well too. Why should that be? So fixed likes continuity. It doesn't necessarily welcome change, particularly Taurus. But Leos can be a bit resistant. And as I mentioned before, about Aquarius there is the duality, but Scorpio is a sign that can be very adhered to a particular pattern until massive changes come along, and then things can happen in a very potent way. So if you are a Scorpio or you know people who are Scorpios, you may have seen that personally firsthand. So I'm sharing with you now on the screen the 2 event charts. So let's have a look first of all at the solar event chart. I don't choose Greenwich because I'm in Britain. It's because of the prime meridian, and I use universal time, not British summer time. So you can see when this event occurs, Pluto inevitably in house 11, and it actually occurs at 3:27 and 19 seconds. I had to do a little bit of checking around in order to nail down those seconds, but there is Pluto in house 11, but does forge a very significant link in house 1 in Aries. Now we know that Venus in Aries is technically debilitated, it's in detriment, but it's in that shimmering alliance with Neptune too. And the angle back to Pluto, and Neptune and Pluto have since 1945 been in a sextile pretty consistently. What we've had in recent times, of course, is the sextile has been Pluto, Capricorn and Neptune in Pisces. So this is a new development with Neptune newly arrived in Aries. So Neptune and Venus together can be very idealistic, but it can be deceptive, to be honest. And Venus in Aries can be a bit of a hothead. Personally, I love reading charts for people who've got Venus in Aries, because I feel that they're people, if they want something, they make it happen, and I quite like that directness. But sometimes that will mean that something's manifested quickly that's not thought through. But if you're a creative person and you're working with someone collaboratively, very Pluto in Aquarius, it could work out extremely well over this period of this retrograde. So don't see it as being necessarily a bad thing, Pluto retrograde. It can have its strengths, and so therefore the networks that we have, some new networks can develop. But also I feel, because Aries is very much about freshness and Pluto can be about purges, maybe there are going to be some fresh people coming in who are going to be better for us, but some of the people we may have been attached to in the past could make way. But of course we do have Mars, the ruler of Aries, in a very, very strong trine with Venus. And in fact, as we go deeper into May, from the 11th onwards, peaking on the 22nd, they forge a perfect trine, and really beautiful, because Venus has been through a dreadful time in that conjunction with Saturn that was repeated 3 times in the sign of Pisces. So that's really positive, but Mars opposite Pluto is less so. If you recall, at the start of November, when Pluto was back in the sign of Capricorn, Mars had moved into Cancer in early September, and they met early in November in an opposition. And that's a very challenging opposition. Mars, very emotional, very passive aggressive, prickly, defensive in Cancer, opposite Pluto in Capricorn, very much about the orthodox, the well-established structures. So something started to manifest then around power that saw in some ways the deconstruction of some of those big structures, and we have seen it in terms of governmental services in America. But then we had the transition of Mars back into the sign of Leo on this particular Mars retrograde, which happens every 2.5 years. So that was in early November. And if you recall, then Mars made its way back into Cancer on the 6th of January. But on the 3rd of January, guess what? Mars and Pluto were directly opposite again. And if you recall, when Mars returned to Leo recently on the 18th of April, once more, not exactly, they were face to face. And then we did have the face-to-face once more again. I think it was around the 25th of April. So that's still in play. So let's think about it. We've got the two rulers of the sign of Scorpio. Pluto's about change, Mars is about action, but it's also about instant gratification, and it's more Scorpio way of being rather than its more Aries way of being, which is much more action orientated, much more impatient. Mars in Scorpio is about desire. So whatever desires we've got, or whoever we encounter, we could come up against someone who's trying to ram their agenda down our proverbial throats. And they're going at it full beam, because Mars in Leo is very much led by ego, to be honest, in its less positive manifestation. In its really positive manifestation, we're talking about musicians, performers, poets, comedians, people who in some ways have the confidence to hold the limelight, public speakers, perhaps even politicians, because it has that self-belief, and that can be very constructive. But in a less positive way, Mars in Leo can be about just getting one's way, and one's way for one's own needs and one's own agenda. So what we've got essentially is the needs of the people, Pluto, are opposed by the agenda of powerful people, powerful individuals. And we just need to be very realistic about that's where we are as this Pluto retrograde begins. So over the next 5 months, there could be some new and exciting relationships made, Pluto, Venus, Neptune, and that helps us to understand more the quality of the associations we currently have. Or we could encounter someone who wants to connect to us, but there's a reason for that. It could be money, could be sex, it could be because we're useful to them. Watch out for those kind of situations over the next 5 months and 10 days. Now, in terms of the event chart, I mentioned before that the ascendant is in Libra, and that forges a brilliant link with Pluto in terms of equal house, making Pluto exactly on the 5th house cusp. But in Placidus, which I use, you can see Pluto's in the 4th. So my view is that how we are affected by the speed of change in terms of technology, and how it's having an impact on us all collectively, is going to be very emotional over these months. And you can see ironically that Mars is right up there in house 10. House 10 really does need to control, be the center of attention, get its own way. So just be conscious of that, because Venus is actually in the 6th house, which is much more to do with sacrifice, helping others, providing services, having more virtuous relationships, not so much necessarily based on intimacy. If we want to talk bluntly, sex. But Mars up there in the 10th house is very much about domination. So just be conscious that we could encounter someone in our personal situations that could be very dominating, but we need to understand that if we don't set our boundary, where this is heading is not necessarily going to be very healthy. So it could be meeting someone that we find utterly irresistible from a sexual viewpoint in terms of attraction, but something in the back of our heads is saying, look, this won't necessarily be good for me. Can we resist getting pulled in? So that's the more addictive component of Pluto and the more desire component of Mars. But like every natal chart, there are always strengths, and we can see Venus, for example, lies pretty well. It's only a degree out from being on the 7th house cusp of this particular ascendant. So charm and diplomacy can still be important, even with Venus in the potentially hot-headed Aries. So I just wanted to summarise it very briefly. I didn't want to go into massive detail in terms of the natal charts, but you can see from a Placidus viewpoint, however much things are presented to us in a quite charming way, which can be very Libra ascendant, seems very reasonable, we need to understand power dynamics. Now that would always be the case with Pluto's retrograde each year. The Pluto retrograde in Aquarius is understanding how we're all connected, the power we can have by coming together to find a voice. It's also important to understand how we can in some ways push back against our dependency on technology, which, you know, Uranus is very much about, and the ruler of the sign of Aquarius, but just being also aware that people will use sheer charisma, Mars in Leo, you can't get much more charismatic than that, in order to persuade us of the benefits of whatever they're proposing. And we need to be very conscious of what the downsides are of whatever seems on the surface to be so alluring. So it could be a new job, it could be that person that we find irresistible, maybe that big ticket item that we want to splash out on that we really feel we deserve. It could be going for a bigger property when the property we have is actually fine, but there's something about the status which could come from Mars in Leo, particularly in the 10th house, that calls out to heal our inner wound. Because if we think about it, most people have some kind of wound, some kind of vulnerability, some part of their nature which doesn't work quite as well as it might. And Pluto retrograde gives us the chance to dive deep, explore. And I think because of the link to Neptune particularly, and also Venus, let's use it positively. But I just want to tell you one other thing about this retrograde. So when Pluto begins the retrograde on the 4th, on the 25th of May, Saturn goes into Aries for the first time since 1999. That is technically in its fall. Some Indian astrologers would say falls are more challenging than detriments, and of course it is going to be conjunct Neptune for the next 3 months and 7 days. Then Saturn will inverse back into Pisces and then re-enter Aries early next year. But with Uranus entering the sign of Gemini on the 7th of July for 4 months, we have a golden triangle forged. So we have a brilliant trine between Uranus in Gemini and Pluto in Aquarius, but we also have the sextiles back to the position of Saturn and also Neptune. So what I would say to you is that when you get the two most strategic planets in astrology collaborating as they will from later in May, we also have got Venus and Mars sparkling together beautifully as this month goes on, a wonderful set of Gemini influences sweeping in towards the end of May. I would say that this Pluto retrograde can bring more blessings than we might imagine. But if it is impacting very precisely on your natal chart, one does need to be aware of it. And it's not just in terms of your sign, it is in terms of the house it's in and whatever planetary aspects that position of those planets is forging. So Pluto can be a trigger point. And as I mentioned before, if you don't know your nativity that well, download it now for free by clicking on the link beneath this video, visiting my website at www.patrickarundell.com. Please stay with me as I go through each of the zodiac signs. Thank you so much for joining me, and goodbye for now. So Aries retrograde occurs exclusively this year in your 11th house. The 11th house, our long-term plan, our friendships, our connections, our higher values and purpose beyond the material plane, which is much more about Capricorn. Because of that first door that I told you about through to the start of August, you may find yourself still needing to work through some delicate and sensitive emotional issues which Saturn has been arousing. Of course, when Saturn moves into your sign on the 25th of May, if you have got planets right at the start of Aries, you're going to feel that. But that's where Venus and Neptune are as well when this event begins. So I would say if you're wanting to bring a new spark or dynamic to your friendships or your social situation, this Pluto retrograde could see a little bit of a clearing out of the old guard. So it doesn't mean to say that you have to stop being friends with people, but you do have executive power over your time use. So if you feel that you have been a little bit bogged down in stale relationships, stale attitudes, people that don't really provide the spark that's so important, you could find yourself connecting to new and rather exciting people over this next 5 months. But if your long-term plan that you have been on isn't working, this could be a time of a major revision. So Taurus, this event sees for you Pluto in house 10. House 10 is our connection to the wider world. It's also how other people see us. If you work in an environment which is very corporate, and you feel that your individual flair and talent is somewhat limited or crushed, you may feel that it's time to break out and do something freer and much more independent. On the other hand, if you're someone who actually feels quite safe and comfortable in that kind of more orthodox environment, you could find yourself pulled into that kind of situation. But if you've got a line manager or a boss who tends to not necessarily be the most pleasant in their approach, leverages, well, you're never going to get on in this business unless you do the unpaid overtime, that could be something that does create somewhat of a dilemma during this period of time. So just be conscious of that, particularly with Saturn joining your 12th house from the 25th of May. But as this event begins, Venus and Neptune are in your 12th house. If there is someone that you're hugely attracted to, and it could be through your work, but you haven't revealed that to them, that person could really capture your imagination over the next few months, and it's going to be interesting how that plays out. Remember, Pluto can be about obsession, but the 10th house is very much about your way to earn a living. It is about goals and ambitions. If you really want to keep it squeaky clean, you're probably going to steer clear of the relationship. Then again, it may be the data gathering and the research you do behind the scenes that can have such a big impact on how you work with your professional aspirations. But if you're not happy around your work, or you have your own business and it's not really working very well, there could be some kind of big reset that's coming over these next 5 months. Gemini, for you, Pluto's retrograde is truly fascinating, because if you're born early in Gemini, Pluto's retrograde could see you in some ways having an opportunity to gain new knowledge, because perhaps you're going to challenge yourself about some of your philosophies, and new information that you gain through the retrograde can prove to be incredibly enlightening, especially when you get Uranus turning up on the first degree of your sign from the 7th of July for 4 months. That's going to be really exciting. So you may find yourself traveling somewhere, connecting with people who are very different, but in some ways some kind of truth or revelation could be teased into the open, because the 9th house is about the higher truth. The sign of Aquarius also can be about truths. So if there is something that you've been involved in around a contractual matter that hasn't been working very well, or some of your connections are not necessarily good for you, those may be ones that will make way. But if you're someone who didn't have the opportunity to embrace higher education when you were younger, a great chance for you to use the delving energies of Pluto to find out more about the kind of courses you could do to test yourself out, to grow your awareness. So Pluto's strength in terms of evolution could really show up for you very strongly in that regard. But if there is something that you have been somewhat attached to that isn't working so well for you, maybe time for some kind of rethink. Now, the 9th house can be about international affairs. overseas travel, or perhaps your thoughts about the way the world as a whole works, and some of those could be revolutionized over this period of time in a way which could surprise you, I feel. So Cancer, the 8th house, is very much to do with where we're most invested. It can be financially, it can be in terms of our devotions, romantically, intimately, it can be spiritually. The 8th house is very deep, but it's where we evolve, but it can be where we evolve out of sight. Pluto, of course, in Aquarius is a much more visible energy. So for example, if you've got some investments, shared finances, which have got some kind of weakness within them, there could be a revelation around those. Also, some way that you've made money up until now, or a scheme you're involved in at the moment, if it's not quite pucker, or it's not quite as clean as it might be, you may be pushed to reconsider your approach. But the 8th house can also be where we have the greatest amount of growth. It can be a time where you go through some kind of transition from one set of ways of being to a new way of being. And when Pluto gets to your 9th house in 244 full time, that will be a brand new horizon. So this is going to be a very deep process that you're going through for a very long time indeed. But I think it's one that you can grow from enormously as well. And if you are someone who's really into personal development, you can embrace Pluto in a very constructive way. If you're someone who's not so attuned to that, that might be what comes up for you over this next 5 months quite powerfully. But if you're connected to someone and the connection isn't quite as good as you hoped it was, that could be revealed too. So Leo, Pluto in retrograde in the 7th house. Now the 7th house is often discussed by astrologers as being about marriage, connections, partnerships. But I feel the 7th house is also where we set our boundaries, because it is, in traditional astrology, also about secret enemies, because Pluto can be about secrets and it can be about power. Someone could show up over the next 5 months who actually will oppose what you want, and that could happen in a very powerful way, particularly on July the 25th, when the Sun will be in your sign directly opposite Pluto. But of course, as this process begins, Mars is in your sign, which has been emboldening you. First of all, it emboldened you from the beginning of November through to the beginning of January. Then, of course, it went back into a very much more psychological area. Ever since it returned to your sign on the 18th of April, you may have been marching confidently forwards. But if there has been someone that you're connecting with who doesn't necessarily see things the same way, that unfortunately could be revealed. So, in a relationship situation, Pluto clearly can be about change, but it can be about power. The power dynamic in a close relationship or friendship within the family could shift. It could be that you're shifting it, someone else is shifting it, you're both shifting it. But around relationships, expect shifts, because being a fixed sign, like the position of Pluto, means that there can be part of you that likes to stick with what you know. But that means that life can be changing around us and we're still maintaining the same posture, which is no longer appropriate. So do be aware that things can change. Not everything is stuck or cast in stone. As long as you take that flexible approach, are prepared to work at things, investigate your own responses, your own attitudes to relationships, this can be a time of enormous growth for you. Virgo, I feel that Pluto's retrograde is particularly fascinating for you because, and I have Pluto in Virgo, because Pluto in the 6th house is kind of emphasizing the things that you have a gift for: routine, details, being conscientious, providing services, not being servile, understanding the need for purity, being very organized in your approach, making sure that things work in a metronomic way, all good stuff. But Pluto can see us perhaps applied to situations that may give us that structure but maybe crush our passion. So if you've been doing a job, for example, or you've had some particular personal ways of going about life that have become a little bit stuck, and perhaps by being rather caught up in just going through the same processes each day, it gives you a degree of comfort, but actually it stops you from really breaking free. Pluto's asking you to revisit this, and it's going to do so for many years to come, but especially over the next 5 months, and particularly in July on the 25th, when the Sun goes face to face with Pluto. And because you've got Mars in your 12th house now, if there are things going on in the back of your situation, the more shadow side of your life that you're not so aware of, that could have an impact emotionally as well as on your physical vitality. So this is a time for sure to think about virtue, but think about how you can change your virtue. So if you're in a job that's unfulfilling, find one that is fulfilling, but that may mean letting go of what you know and what's comfortable, and that obviously can be scary, as change can be. So that's the challenge for this Pluto retrograde for you in particular. Libra, I feel that this Pluto retrograde can really be exciting for you because it starts in a tremendous angle with your ruler Venus alongside Neptune. Now, although Venus is technically debilitated in Aries, for you it's on your 7th house, as I've been mentioning recently, and that's where you can shine. So your ability to interact with people skillfully, charmingly, and also very charismatically, with Pluto in the 5th house, it's kind of saying to you, look, do you have potential romantically or creatively to grow? And it's something that you can investigate with Pluto's retrograde. With Uranus moving into your 9th house through the summer months, that also can push you to be a bit more daring. Saturn in your 7th house, well, I do agree with that. If you're born right at the start of Libra, Saturn moving there for the 3 months from the 25th of May could ask some key questions. But it could also be a time where if you put the commitment in, something can evolve in a very constructive way. So of all the signs, I feel that you could come out of this particular retrograde very well. But as ever, it's all about a willingness to evolve. And of course, if you have got planets right at the end of Libra, that means that Pluto is broadly in a square. So that can be a bit more challenging. But overall, if you're wanting to improve all sorts of interactions, it doesn't have to be romantically. Just having the confidence to enjoy life, meeting up with people, pursuing interests that are fun and enlightening, but you can gain from the collaboration you have with others. There's a lot to go for here. So if through the years of Pluto being in the 4th house, it has deconstructed your confidence, and also Saturn in the 6th house recently has diminuted your physical vitality, and it's been a lot of give and not a lot of get. Give yourself permission to have some fun over the next 5 months. So Scorpio, modern ruler, goes retrograde. It's in an opposition with Mars, your traditional ruler, but they've been off and on having a dust up for some months now. And it's possible that you have been feeling some tensions because Pluto wants to evolve, Mars wants to dominate, it wants to be on top. And for you, as this process begins, because it is in the 10th house, the 10th house is the way you're going to strut your stuff professionally. And therefore, if you've got emotional vulnerabilities which are inhibiting your potential to make progress, this is the time to try to understand what those fears and anxieties may be. If something isn't working around your family or home life, you will need to look at it. So don't let a fearfulness of opening up, a resistance to being a little more vulnerable, prevent you from embracing the best of your modern ruler's energy, because this happens every year, this 5-month retrograde, but this year exclusively in the part of your chart to do with where you live, how you live there, who with, family, and your inner world. One way you could make Pluto retrograde work for you is some kind of a renovation, because Pluto can be like the phoenix. So if you're living in a property that could benefit from some kind of facelift or reconstruction, a great chance to go for it. but you need to be aware of what your motives are, because Mars can make this rather complex, just to the point where you may need to submit a little bit to the more tender side of yourself and life. There may be another side of you that bitterly resists it. Sagittarius, words have power, a lot of power. And over the last couple of years, unfortunately, Saturn, I think, has been in some ways taking away a little bit of your natural fiery spark. So the fact that as this process begins, Venus and Neptune are in an awesome relationship with Pluto, I feel that you should be very hopeful of what the next 5 months represents for you. But it may be because the third house is about the people we live and connect to every day. It can be siblings, neighbours, community, internet, technology, our mode of transport. All of those things are areas that can change, but also the third house is about beliefs. Pluto can be very, very much keen. It can almost be obsessed with our ideas. So just be aware with Mars opposite that you're not going forwards, because it's much more important for you to stay deeply embedded in having discussions, inverted commas, about the rights and wrongs of life. Turn Pluto into an inward process and think about how you can evolve in your inner world, make it more fluid, quicker, more nimble, very third house energy, but use your passion for knowledge to unlock a greater capacity within you to use the information you have got, but in a way which works in the inside of your life, rather than being caught up in big debates on the outside. So Capricorn, Pluto retrograde in your second house. What do you value? What's really important to you? Is it everyday money? Is it a particular way of using your resources? Do you have a particular attachment to certain things? Maybe it's spending money, maybe it's foods. Second house can be very much about foods. Whatever those things are, they could be challenged for sure by the retrograde, but it's also a chance to shake things up. I feel that that shake-up could be around where you live, funnily enough, particularly with your ruler Saturn pitching up in the sign of Aries from the 25th of May and forging the alliance with Pluto. So if you get your home working better, more efficiently, whether it means making repairs, whether it's decoratively initially with Venus in such a great link to Pluto, whether it's family finances, whether it's your values aligning with people who are immediately around you in a better way, or are there going to be some revelations about where there is a lack of alignment? So that's possible too. Pluto won't work in all one direction, but one of the ways it will be asking you to think about is what you value, but do you value it for the right reasons? It's not me saying that. I think that's the rhetorical question that Pluto will ask you over the next 5 months. So Aquarius, and being right at the start of the sign myself at 31 minutes into the sign, so Pluto nesting right on my sun over the last couple of years, off and on, has been a change, profound change, because in a way when the sun is joined by Pluto, it does give us a chance to transform ourselves with great power and great vigor, but it's not something we should resist. And of course the house it's in is really important. For me, the third house, guess what, we've rebuilt the website, so that needed to be done and the process isn't finished. But the third house can also be our connection to siblings, our community, but also to our neighbours. If you have undergone some changes there with Pluto pitching up in Aquarius, particularly in this third phase from the 19th of November, and there have been some power dynamics played out at some stage, especially if people don't necessarily like the way you convey who you are, or people feel you're overbearing or want to get your own way, or you're encountering people who always want to get their own way and in some ways want to keep you down. So in any situation, if you feel that your identity is not being allowed to flourish, that's where you need to push back with this retrograde, but the planets are conspiring magnificently. This is the best Pluto retrograde for a long time because of Venus and Neptune, because of Saturn, your traditional ruler, because of Uranus, your modern ruler, all come into line fabulously well with Pluto over the months to come. There's lots to be excited about, but of course with Pluto we have to be open to evolution, and we have to be open to deep and sometimes painful truths, and sometimes letting go of things that no longer serve our greater good. So Pisces, Pluto in the 12th house is probably one of the more awkward retrogrades, if I'm being totally truthful. It comes at a time when Saturn is nearing the end of its second big phase through your sign. It will come back to you at the 1st of September after going briefly for 3 months and 7 days into Aries from the 25th of May. But Pluto in the 12th house could, particularly over the next 5 months, make you much more conscious of things that you're fearful of, the things you don't really want to look at. Could be anxieties, could be some tender points, could be past issues that where someone held power over you or insisted that you held a secret, kept something quiet in order for them to get some kind of freedom from what they did. So some difficult stuff could come up through this retrograde, to be honest. But also, it is an opportunity to think about where you've been perhaps using separation, where you've been trying to spin out and gain some freedom from pain through some of your life choices. So, whatever it is, you can definitely be obsessed by things that on the face of it are very good for us. Whether it's marathon running, or you see people going by and they're looking at their watch. I'm sorry if this is you. They've got their water tank and it's very, very intense. And I understand why, because I used to do marathons. But actually, it's great to run and just enjoy the countryside or get the rhythm going inside our bodies. If it's always against the clock, yet I get improving all the time, which is very, very valuable and important. I did the same. But there's also a point where it becomes a little bit too important and we forget about the enjoyment of the running, or we get so caught up in being virtuous that we never give ourselves the opportunity to have a drink or a bit of chocolate, because no, we can't do that. And therefore it becomes much more obsessive. So if there's something you're doing that's virtuous, that you're doing to the greatest extent, perhaps it's time to rethink. But if there has been some escapism that you've been using that's not necessarily being, we all have a bit, whatever it is, whether it's having a cup of tea or having a sneaky play on whatever that gives us that short-term dopamine rush, to have that little bit of escapism. It's part of the human way of surviving. You shouldn't feel guilty about it. But if there is some deep patterns there that you feel are locking you into a jail, so you're not going for opportunities that are there for you because you don't feel that it would quite work for you, you could be missing out on something. So it is definitely a time to challenge yourself, not necessarily take it from anyone else, but challenge yourself. So if you're open to psychology, open to life coaching, having some counselling, unlocking some of the mysteries that have been self-limiting in terms of your true potential, what an opportunity this next 5 months hold for you. Thanks for joining me for this Pluto retrograde deep dive. Please check out my new website at patrickarundell.com. It really has got so many good things in there that you can enjoy for free. But if you would like to have a one-to-one with me, I am a consulting astrologer. It's the main thing I do. Please check out my testimonials to see what other people have found working closely with me. For now, take care and all the best over the next 5 months and 10 days of this Pluto retrograde.